Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
We begin with Larrie Ferreiro. Larrie teaches history and engineering at George Mason University in Northern Virginia, and his most recent book is Brothers at Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. Larrie, it's a great privilege to have you on this program, sir. Thanks so much for making time for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
I want to start with a little something I tell my students, which is history is not the past. History is the story that we tell about the past. The past never changes, but history often does. If it's done right, it will change because as time passes, we learn more about the past. We endeavor to find a more complete and thoughtful narrative about the past. And so quite often, history does change the way we understand and talk about the past. And your book is such a terrific example of that lesson, Larrie. You have not been satisfied with the narrative of the American Revolution. You shed light on a whole part of the American Revolution that hitherto has often been the subject of grad school seminars.
Yes, it had its origins in what I've traced to the manifest destiny era of the 19th century. This is the period from just before the Civil War to a little bit afterwards, when we had the notion that we were destined to expand across the continent. And there was also the stirrings of the kind of American exceptionalism that we were somehow materially different from our predecessors, or for that matter, from anyone else around us. And that concept shaped some of the histories, notably a particular set of stories by a historian named George Bancroft, which really set the stage for the American narrative for more than a century to come. And there, the idea that we were exceptional, we were different, so we were able to raise ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and we certainly didn't want to be seen having any assistance or aid from the people, the very nations that we were trying to break away from, the European monarchies. That would never have done. So that creation myth that somehow we created ourselves without any outside help, that we brought ourselves into independence by our own, from our own bootstraps, was started, but it never was true, and it was never a good fit. So when I began looking into this story, it was actually, curiously enough, not from the point of view of how are they teaching the American Revolution. I actually started to look at it more as a history of technology when I was doing my own doctoral work, and I had learned looking at shipbuilding in the Age of Sail, somewhat arcane perhaps, but a focal part of that was how France and Spain worked together. They exchanged information and shipbuilders to create a unified navy in order to defeat Britain, and that was what was at the centerpiece of the War of American Independence. So I knew that was the case, and when my children started to go to school and learn the history, and I saw their history books, I saw this gap between that story that they had learned and what I knew to be true of the assistance that we had received from those two nations, which fought alongside the Americans to for their own ends, of course, but to really secure our own independence. And it was from that gap in the narrative versus the facts that I began to research and then eventually to write this story.
So I remember in grade school and high school hearing about the French Navy that miraculously showed up just in time at Yorktown, which secured an American victory in Virginia and in the Middle Atlantic. Of course, the British held on to places like New York for years more. Beyond that, we usually don't hear about France and Spain securing the American Revolution. Explain it to us, Larry. When you talk about France and Spain contributing to the success of the American Revolution, being invested, fighting alongside us, what exactly did that look like?
And you have that narrative right. Most of the time, the only thing you see is perhaps Lafayette showing up to help out. And at the very end, the French suddenly appear, and it gives no context, and certainly does have that Deus Ex Machina feel to the story. So, and you see this in movies and television. And the history goes so far further back than even the Declaration of Independence, which, as I will explain in a few minutes, was written very specifically to ask France and Spain to come fight alongside us. It started at the end of the 7 Years' War. We called it the French and Indian War, and that started out as a series of skirmishes in the Ohio Valley between British troops and French troops, both of whom were trying to expand their own territories. Britain, of course, had the east coast of America. France had Canada and Louisiana. And those series of skirmishes eventually erupted into a world war involving not just Britain and France, but pulling in Spain, Austria, and a whole host of other nations, and was fought around the world. And it ended in 1763 quite well for the British. They were the dominant nation on the planet, and it left France and Spain quite behind in terms of their power and their territories. They lost a lot. France lost Canada, Spain lost Florida, they both lost prestige, and both nations knew that they wanted to get revenge, and that was the actual word they used, revanche in French. But they also understood the only way they could go back against the British was together. Neither France nor Spain had the capability alone to take on the British Navy, which was the most powerful navy on Earth. And you have to understand that conflicts at this time were primarily naval. We're talking about empires, not land battles anymore, and empires require powerful navies. That's where my research had gotten into the exchange of engineers and shipbuilders so that they could create this unified navy. So they already knew that they wanted to regain power, but what's curious is that along the way they also were looking across the Atlantic and realizing that the Americans were dissatisfied with the arrangements that Britain had imposed upon its colonists after the 7 Years' War. There were an increasing series of taxes and restrictions on trade that they knew were going to boil over. And in fact, one of the French ministers at that time said in a letter that only the coming American Revolution, he said, would ensure that the British would be reduced to a state of weakness. Those lines were said in 1767. This is 8 years before the Americans even knew themselves they were going to fight a war, and he knew, as did his Spanish counterparts, because they'd been sending spies, observers, to keep tabs on the state of the citizenry in colonial Britain, and they knew that tensions were boiling over. So when the war began, insinuations of the war started in 1774, just when a new French king, King Louis the 16th, was coming to power, and all of his ministers. The war was just starting to become a possibility. And in 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, both France and Spain knew this was the moment that they'd been waiting for, to help, that by helping to support an American insurrection, they could seriously weaken Britain and achieve their own aims.
And they would also have access to those American markets that the laws, 18th century laws for decades had said that everything coming from America has to go through British ports first before it can go to a place like Holland or France or Spain. And they want to cut out the middleman. And if you can support those Americans to gain independence, you have immediate access to those markets yourself.
Yes, and they've been trading with the Americans for some time, and certainly opening the American markets was a consideration. They knew that that was going to supply their own merchants with much needed capital. I think, though, the real consideration was political rather than economic. In all of the correspondence that I've seen, the ministers really speak to the need to weaken British power, especially in Europe, as their driving factor. And yes, if we can get some of the trade, that would also be nice. But the interesting thing is that trade that had already been happening between France and America and Spain and America proved to be the first lifeline for we the Americans. Even before either nation committed troops or naval forces, they were secretly arming the American insurgents. One of the things that helped them was this these smuggling operations that had been begun decades before to circumvent the British restrictions on trade. As you said, Americans were not allowed, in theory, to send any of their products overseas except through Britain, and the British merchants would set the price, and they'd take a hefty cut, and then they'd resell them at a much greater profit. Most American merchants did everything they could to circumvent that. George Washington was no exception. He was certainly trying to sell his agricultural products from Mount Vernon to the Caribbean and elsewhere. So those smuggling routes were perfect for bringing in contraband arms, munitions, gunpowder, for the simple reason that in 1775, we had no capability to manufacture arms, to manufacture gunpowder, to arm our militia. It was rather, as like a teenager who decides that he wants to run away from home, but he doesn't have a penny to his name. So what are we going? How will we fight one of the greatest empires on earth when we don't have a navy? We have only a few gunsmiths who can make perhaps one gun per month to arm the militia and the Continental Army. We don't have a navy, which is what you need to fight the British, and there were no factories to manufacture cannon or gunpowder. Well, the British were supplying their own armies with from factories that were making hundreds of thousands of arms per year. France and Spain were the obvious targets, and what they started to do at first was turn a blind eye to merchants who were profiting from the sale of muskets, gunpowder, usually for product. The Americans didn't have any coin to spare, but they had plenty of tobacco, which was the primary commodity that they were looking for in Europe. We sold cod. We had all the smuggling routes already planned. And that was helping for a little while, but British blockades really took a toll on that trade. So in 1776, even before the Americans declared for independence, France and Spain together agreed that they would start sending arms and munitions using merchants as frontmen to keep the the Americans fighting and keep the British pinned down in North America. They did not want them, the British, to be anywhere else except in the American colonies. So men like Diego de Gardoqui in Spain and Pierre Caron de Beaumarchais in France became the merchants who brought arms, supplies, and gunpowder to the Americans, and it really is what kept them from losing in those first years of the war.
Larry, we see these weapons coming in and this investment very early on in strategic supplies coming from France and Spain. But do they at some point start to specialize in their support? Because we see French soldiers, the French Navy on the coast of America, but not so much Spain, do we? Don't we see more money coming from Spain rather than soldiers?
Yeah, well, each nation actually was involved in a somewhat different way, even though they themselves were aligned together. Spain and France actually had an alliance called the Bourbon Family Compact. Both King Carlos III of Spain and Louis XVI of France were descended from Louis XIV, the Sun King. France was actually sending volunteers, although most of them came of their own accord. They really wanted to fight the British because that was the enemy. And after the 7 Years' War, individuals themselves wanted to come and take revenge. And that's where you see people like Lafayette in particular, but other officers as well, coming without the direct support of the French government to fight alongside the Americans. When the French and the Spanish were giving arms and munitions and watching the Americans fight, and fight quite bravely, but not always, in fact, quite frequently lose the battles that they were fighting. The Battle of Long Island, for example, was a particularly devastating loss. They started to understand that if the British won, which they were likely to do, they would then have a reunited colonial power in North America, and that reunited colonial British power would threaten the colonies that France and Spain had in the Caribbean, which were the source of much of the income that those two nations got. The French had many sugar colonies, which was a major source of money. Spain's colonies in the Caribbean and South America were vital to its empire, and they knew that they could not allow that reunited empire to threaten them. So the first thing that happened in 1778 is France made the decision to have an alliance with the Americans. Let me take a quick step back, because there's something of a misconception that the victory of the Battle of Saratoga, which was in late 1777, was the reason why France decided to join with the Americans. And that's not quite accurate. What I found was that even before that, the minister in charge of foreign affairs, his name was the Comte de Vergennes, and his name is vitally important because of all the people that I speak about in my book, these brothers at arms. It was Vergennes who directed the actions, who took the decisions, who made all the major parts move and put them into place in order for all of this support to get to the Americans. So I want to give a shout-out to the Comte de Vergennes. And he'd already made that decision that the possibility of an American loss was too great to bear. Fortunately, a lot of those arms that I had mentioned that were being smuggled across the ocean had been arriving, and a large shipment of arms came from Beaumarchais just in time to supply the soldiers who were trying to keep the British General Burgoyne, from marching down from Canada down the Hudson to link up in New York City and cut the nation in two. The Americans met him at Saratoga and, armed with French muskets, French cannon, gunpowder from primarily France, they were able to defeat Burgoyne. It was a stunning victory. And that gave Vergennes, that stunning victory gave Vergennes the pretext to form the alliance that he knew he was going to do anyway. So when that alliance happened, when they signed the treaty, Benjamin Franklin was the chief negotiator. That immediately brought the French Navy to American shores. Now, at this point, Spain was still out of the picture in terms of direct fighting. Spain was still providing arms and munitions, much of which went up the Mississippi River to help the Americans in the Western theater, especially around Fort Pitt, now Pittsburgh. But they had their own interests, and they did not see a line with the Americans as helping them. But more to the point, in 1778, they had a treasure fleet at sea carrying the equivalent of $50 billion, with a B, dollars in silver from Peru. And until that fleet was safely in port in Spain, they couldn't risk going to war with Britain for fear that the British would try to capture that convoy. So they stayed out of the fight for the first year. But France knew they would eventually join because France could never win a war against Britain without Spain by its side. The first fleets that came over, the Comte d'Estaing was the commander, fought first in Rhode Island and then in Savannah, trying to drive the British from both places, and they failed. The Battle of Rhode Island was interrupted by first the British fleet and then by a hurricane. The Battle of Savannah, which happened sometime later, was a complete rout. The British maintained their control over Savannah, and in fact, Georgia became, in effect, a British colony again for the rest of the war. But what it did do, and this was the critical thing, it kept the British Navy from having free access to the ocean, which meant that now the British commanders had to consolidate their troops. So they had been in places like Philadelphia, where they drove the Continental Congress out of town. Now they were afraid that with the French Navy operating off the coast, they would no longer have free rein. They had to bring their troops back to New York City and consolidate the rest of their troops. And that really put a major dent in their operation.
Yeah.
So that was the first phase of the war that took us through about the end of 1778.
So, Larry, let me just ask you this. This is a part of the story of the American Revolution that has largely been lost to history, and we'll explore that in a minute. This idea of American exceptionalism, and it was, in many ways, it was written out of the history books because it didn't fit with that larger narrative that we did it all by ourselves, and it's true American grit and independence, that we actually relied on these traditional monarchical powers in Europe, and we wouldn't have won. That we would not have won if they hadn't been there for us. But Americans at the time, they were so palpably aware of the contributions of French and Spain, and one need only look at when the Marquis de Lafayette came back to America on his grand tour in 1824. He was America's first rock star. He would go into these towns and cities up and down the East Coast, and it was complete mayhem. In every state, Americans understood the debt that we owed to France and to Spain that made our independence possible.
Absolutely. And they actually understood that in 1776. When you read the writings of the Founding Fathers, they're very clear why they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They said, we I'm paraphrasing, we can't win the war without France and Spain. And it was also clear that neither France nor Spain would come to fight in a civil war. They certainly wouldn't help the Americans if all they were trying to do was get a better deal from the British. They would only fight as allies or in concert with an independent sovereign nation, which is why they said, we will write a Declaration of Independence as the only means of having our of France and Spain join us. And the first considered action by the Founding Fathers after that declaration was signed was to put it on a ship, literally two or 3 days after it was signed, and send it to France in hopes that they would join us. Before this, if you wanted to be independent, you fought the war, you won, you didn't need to write anything down. So this was quite unusual. And you're absolutely correct. 50 years later, when Lafayette was one of the last of the people who had fought in that war, people, you were already seeing the elders had already, many of them had died off, and Jefferson and Adams would pass away just a couple of years later. That understanding of our debt, and I hesitate to use the word debt because that implies that once it's been repaid, that's the end of the relationship. And one of the things that I keep emphasizing in my book, and the reason why it's called Brothers at Arms, is because it's never been just about a transaction. It's always been about a commitment to each other. And that commitment, I think, was particularly noticeable when America was at its lowest point. After those two operations that I had mentioned, Newport and Savannah, really failed, and we were at a nadir. We were at a very low point. Valley Forge had certainly sapped some of our strength. There were a little bit later in 1780, there were insurrections within the lines of the Americans. They weren't getting paid. Just at this point, Spain enters the picture. They decide that it is now that their treasure fleet is home, it's time to make war on the British. They're going to go in with the French, and they launch a series of operations that changes the war from this regional conflict on the coasts and inland of North America to a war across the world. There's literally fighting in every corner, from the North Sea to Gibraltar, Minorca in the Mediterranean, South Africa, all the way to India, where France was had been allied with the Indian state of Mysore to drive the British East India Company out of the subcontinent. And it was that entry of Spain and that created a world war that eventually sapped Britain's strength. And that's when America by itself was just unable to advance the cause of independence. And it was in all of this fighting that was happening around the world, including in places like Florida, where the Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez was driving the British bit by bit from the Gulf of Mexico, attacking Mobile, attacking Baton Rouge, and then in 1781, finally assaulting and capturing the British capital at Pensacola. It was at that point that this fleet that you had mentioned that appears and helps to set the stage for the defeat of the British at Yorktown, that was part of that worldwide campaign. There were that fleet, which was led by the Comte de Grasse, a very important figure. And yes, since you asked, the Comte de Grasse was an ancestor of Neil de Grasse, Tyson, the famed astrophysicist. There were fleets being sent in addition to India and to the Caribbean, all to take the fight to the British. They were being pulled in many different directions by this point, and they had no allies. So when de Grasse's fleet finally appeared in the Chesapeake, and it did so in a large part because the Spanish had made arrangements for the French colonies in the islands in the Caribbean to be protected from British attack while the French were away. So that was a critical part of this campaign. It was because all of the campaigns around the world were starting to finally come to fruition, and it was de Grasse's victory off of the Chesapeake that kept the British from reinforcing or extracting Cornwallis at Yorktown. And that's what enabled the Americans to work side by side with the French. Here, the other person of note, of course, is the Comte de Rochambeau, who was Washington's equal in every way, in terms of political savvy, experience. The two men became very good friends, and they were equals in each other's eyes. And they fought side by side to bring Cornwallis to surrender. And this is an amazing feat of logistics on the parts of all of the players.
Larrie Ferreiro is the author of the new book, Brothers at Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. Larry, stay with me. We'll take a very quick break. And when we get back, we will let this conversation provide context for the recent presidential election and Donald Trump's successful campaign slogan, Make America Great Again. Welcome back. My guest is Professor of History at George Mason University, Larrie Ferreiro. His new book is Brothers at Arms. Larry, you wrote recently an essay for the Daily Beast that the America First campaign that we see with Donald Trump, the economic nationalism, what critics have said is white nationalism, that they're getting history all wrong. Let the first part of our conversation be context for your take on what we are seeing today in the 21st century here in America with this historic and what millions of Americans would say startling results of the presidential election.
You mentioned America First, and all of the phrases that have been used in this campaign that seem to give the notion that of American first, American greatness. This is all about how we can operate by ourselves without the intervention of anybody else, pull up the drawbridge, and certainly not let anyone except a very narrowly defined subset of individuals back into this country. That's the same mindset that we were talking about earlier, that manifest destiny, that we're not really part of what had happened in the past. I looked up where some of these phrases had originated, and it's not out of context to say that the phrase American greatness, which is probably the one that popped up the most, actually was first used in 1776. It was right after the Declaration was signed, within weeks. But it didn't mean that we were somehow better and therefore different than the rest of the world. It was actually an appeal, and I have the quote here. It was said at Yale University by who would be the future president, Timothy Dwight, that the foundations of American greatness are to act not like the inhabitants of a village, but like citizens of a world. He was exhorting his peers and his students to go out and be part of a world, and that's what I try. That's what we. That's how we started, is what I argue in this book, and why it is important today to take that view. The idea that we are able to operate independently from anyone else has never been correct. Just again, to take the examples from what I talk about in Brothers at Arms, we started our existence as depending not just upon our alliances, but also on our immigrants who, as the Hamilton musical says, got the job done. I mentioned, of course, people like Lafayette, who came and fought alongside us. There were other people as well. Washington's right-hand man, his engineer, Louis Lebesgue Duportet, was a critical part of this campaign. But that influence extended well beyond the war and into who we became as a nation. And so the first thing, I'll talk about alliances in a minute, but one thing we've been able to do, I think, better than any other nation is integrate with our immigrants, not simply integrate our immigrants into the culture. In other words, the nation changes and improves with the people who come over. And I can give you that the first instance, Duportet's ideas for creating a standing army, a standing corps of engineers, for creating a school at West Point. Those all became part of the fabric of the American military. Those were not American ideas. They weren't British ideas. Those were French ideas. And we adapted them to our own needs and improved. And we continually did that throughout our history. I study technology. The people who manufactured the cars that created an America that was open to all. Many of them were people who came from overseas, immigrants working in those factories. Silicon Valley today, well over half the startups are people who were born overseas and came to America to bring their ideas. And we have always, always, always benefited from that. So this idea that you can somehow pull up the drawbridge has never been who we are as a people.
Even though it makes no historical sense, even though the message gets history all wrong, to pull up the drawbridge and make America first resonates so powerfully with millions of Americans. They love that message.
And an equal number of Americans, more Americans, are frightened by that message. And the fact that we have always been a nation that has both accepted our people from overseas and at the same time been afraid of them has been the tension that has driven our history. And the issue is that every single time the fear took over from the hope, that's when things went downhill. So when we stopped, for example, Asians from coming over, that had a a negative effect on our economy when we stopped the people from coming from different parts of Europe. That really didn't cripple us, but it certainly hurt us considerably. When fear takes over, we suffer. And that's not just the United States. I can point to examples where the fear of different peoples in Europe caused, for example, in France, the Huguenots, French Protestants, to be evicted from the nation. We're talking about the 1600s and 1700s. They then went to Britain, which brought them in with more or less open arms, and started the Industrial Revolution, which made Britain the workshop of the world. They were the ones who were able to take those individuals who'd been rejected for fear and brought them in, and that's what not just kick-started the British economy, but made it the most powerful economy in the world. And that has always been what has made the American economy so strong, so diverse, and so vibrant, is when we've been able to overcome that minority of fear and accept that majority of hope.
And yet that tension, as you say, that has always been at play, it's in our DNA as Americans. It's in our founding documents. All men are created equal, and yet we condone slavery. And the tragic and sad part is, Larry, that may never be worked out. we may always be struggling, and it's there in the history of the West, in the modern age, this progress that is struggling to bring gains, positive gains to humanity. The past has always pushed back. There's always this traditionalist, fundamentalist zeitgeist that is always reluctant to let go of the past and pushes back against progress.
Absolutely, and when we see that pushback, that's when we stop advancing. And the fortunate cycle is, after a period of time, the realization that it's not working comes back, and just as after the Asian Exclusion Acts were eventually overturned, and other immigration acts were put aside, we saw a huge influx that brought the economy back, roaring back. So I would, as a historian, I would like to take the long view. It's very hard. I will be perfectly frank with you, to take the long view when you're looking at the next few months or few years and wondering if the kind of futures for the children who are graduating schools and looking to move out into the world, depend upon that broad view. It's the same tension that you see not just here in the United States, in Britain, which has just recently taken the vote to withdraw itself from a vibrant European Union, and now thousands, if not millions, of people, students, are wondering what will my future hold in a world that I'd expected to be open to me and now is closed. And I also want to just very briefly say that the misconception that we can look inwards to help our own economy has never been who we are as Americans. And let me be very clear, our alliances, and I don't just mean military, I mean economic and other, have always been what sustain us and keep our internal economy moving. We've been, for now well over 70 years, the power that has kept trade, people, diplomacy moving and moving freely and efficiently. And it's that has enabled us to prosper, and we have, and the world to prosper. If you start to draw back from that in too hurried a fashion, the chances that we will remain the single dominant power in the world may not be so great. But if it happens precipitously, it creates a power vacuum in the world. And it doesn't mean that another nation steps in, but it means that now the world becomes fragmented. And a fragmented world is the world we saw back in 1776. Several loci of power, conflicts, insurrections. If that's not managed properly, if the United States withdraws from the world as that power that can keep nations and trade moving, and I'm not talking about police, I'm talking about being the power that is able to influence not just its own region, but everywhere in the world, the risk is it becomes fragmented far more quickly than the rest of the world can manage. So
well, there's no better example of that than Europe after World War I, when Britain and the United States walked home after World War I and disengaged from the continent. And, we saw fascist movements in Italy and Germany, which changed the course of world history. And at the same time, you have the American First movement in America in the 1920s and 30s. And this turning our back on the world has never, ever been the answer. I mean, history is not shy about telling us that doesn't work. And the challenge is that we have this economic globalism that we have. It's been done in such a way that it has incredibly enriched a very small elite at the expense of the American working class. Now, it has in turn benefited the majority of Americans by reducing costs and providing goods from around the world, but at the expense of the working class in America. They have been left behind as those jobs went elsewhere. But then again, if you're a student of history, you understand that is how capitalism works. The industries and the jobs do go in search of the cheapest labor they can find, and those jobs have always moved. They've always been moving.
Up cheapest labor, and if we just have a minute or so,
yeah.
I'm going to revert to my roots as a historian of technology and not necessarily a historian of the American Revolution. The cheapest labor has been robots and software. And the thing that was always distressing to me in this campaign is that the real source of this labor loss for the past 50 years have been automation, robots, software. Of every 10 jobs that have been lost in the past 20 to 30 years, 9 of them were lost to automation, not to outsourcing,
wow,
and not to immigration.
And we're only going to see more of that.
We're talking about losing jobs to name your country, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines. Actually, that's not the case. We're losing jobs to software. And so far, there's been no revolt against software that I can tell. So the argument about globalization has really missed the mark and missed it by miles. And I don't know how we as a nation, as a society, are going to bring the discussion back to where it needs to go. And that's very simply, in a world where more things are done by machine, and how will we not just have jobs, but how will the companies that have automated get people to buy the goods that these robots are manufacturing when there's nobody is left with a job to buy them? That's going to be
that's scary.
Actual discussion that will have substance. All these Pacific Trade Pacts and NAFTA. Those are important. Don't get me, please do not misconstrue anything I'm saying. But the real impact on who we will be as a society is going to revolve more around how we accommodate this change in technology that is unprecedented. And I've been studying technology for some time.
And Larrie,
I think that would be a wonderful conversation for perhaps another.
Yeah, I was going to
show.
say, let's definitely do that, because that massive, unprecedented displacement of workers around the world is the train coming down the tracks of humanity. That is absolutely, in the 20th century, you see the displacement of blue-collar workers, but in the 21st century, we're going to see the displacement owing to software and artificial intelligence, robots, whatever you want to call them. We are going to see the displacement of white-collar workers, accountants, lawyers, doctors even, will be displaced by these newer technologies in ways that we have never seen on a scale that we have never, ever experienced in a human story.
Precisely. And for me, it's a fascinating experience to go from the 18th century to the 21st century and back. I think I'm suffering from whiplash or decompression sickness to do that. But it's what really drives our, my interest and really our interest is being able to make those connections.
Yeah.
It's not that history repeats itself, but it certainly does rhyme, and we can see the traces of today's dilemmas in the dilemmas of the time around American independence.
Larrie Ferreiro, the new book is Brothers at Arms, American Independence and the Men of France and Spain Who Saved It. Larrie, let's definitely talk again. I would look forward to that. And congratulations on the new book. It's a beautiful book, and I cannot recommend it strongly enough.
Well, thank you for those words, and it's been a pleasure being on your show. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.